Dear BJ, no sign of the coronavirus, but get this, the university I work for is extending spring break by a week, and then we move online for the rest of the semester. I get to work remotely, so hello home office. I'm turning a corner of the studio into a writing nook. We will Zoom, that's a new verb for you, to meet online. It's a virtual video on audio conferencing thing, so you can see everyone online. I wish you weren't so analog. I'd love to see you and hear your voice again like we're in the same room. Always, me. P.S. The photo is of downtown Pulaski. I think it sums up the starkness of the now. Wish you were here. And so it begins. My Postcards from the Pandemic, a Pulaski memoir, a photographic and written intimate one-sided correspondence based on the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's imagine for a moment that you've just discovered a curious old box. Maybe you're in a museum, an antique store, or maybe you're in your grandmother's attic and you feel compelled to open that box. And inside it, you find a stack of old postcards. The images on the front might be photographs. You're not quite sure. They seem to feature landscapes and old buildings. And perhaps you wonder, how old are these cards anyway? And you turn the cards over and you see they're all addressed to someone named BJ and are only signed me. So who is BJ and who is me? As you begin to read, you notice the cards refer to some place called Pulaski, Virginia, and they start when people went into lockdown and isolation in 2020. Some people seem to have worn masks, some didn't. There were cards about shortages, Black Lives Matters, working remotely, weird walls in D.C., stress of a presidential nature, and something called Zoom. And if you put all the postmarks in chronological order, you see the seasons change. A story develops, and when the cards are all read, you suddenly wonder, well, what happens to BJ? I'm not the first person to tell stories through the idea of a mail art correspondence. Many years ago, my mother introduced me to an unusual book trilogy called Griffin and Sabine, An Extraordinary Correspondence by illustrator Nick Mantock. And it's a love story told between two artists through a postcard and mail art communique. And I've always loved the idea of stories told this way. And the COVID-19 pandemic provided me with a fodder I needed to do my own. As this idea percolated, I became curious about how other photographers expressed themselves during a similar crisis a century ago, the 1918 pandemic. There was Edward Steichen and his moody documentary work for the U.S. Air Service during World War I. And there was Louis Hines working for the Red Cross, showing the toll of war and the pandemic in France. And then there was Alfred Stieglitz, who was falling in love with painter Georgia O'Keeffe, finding the ravages of influenza upon her body an inspiration for a new genre of photography involving realism. In some ways, this survey saddened me. I'd always found salvation in the work of pictorialism, a turn-of-the-century photography movement, where the photographer is not as much concerned about the reality, but the atmosphere. And through the manipulation of the photograph during the developing and printing processes, shadows and light are heightened and focus becomes selective. Both Steichen and Stieglitz have been my heroes from this movement. This is an example of Steichen's pictorialist work involving nocturnes and a process called gun bichromate. This is the work that really resonates with me. This particular piece is Stieglitz, The Hand of Man, and I think it captures the grit of the early industrial age. It's a bit like time travel. But the farther I went into my survey, the more I looked at images like George Davidson's The Onion Field, the one at the far right, the more I knew that I was on the right path for my own aesthetic for this particular series. It's a style I've explored for years, but I've always been very passionate about depicting emotion and atmosphere more than documenting a particular place or time. I also looked at postcards from 1918. I thought if I was going to do a series based on postcards, I wanted to give a literal shout out to the actual tourism detritus from the past. And so I utilized a similar graphic design style for my own cards. Dear BJ, the cats thank you for their care package of canned pâté, since there seems to be a shortage of such things. And I thought your creativity in making the cans resemble a flower was very Valentine's Day. And you know I love the handmade Victorian origami. What is that thing called anyway? Oh, and the ruby earrings hidden inside. But on a different note, before sending me propaganda, BJ, please check the facts and the sources against real-world information. There is a divide between truth and alternative facts. Yes, creative nonfiction. Was it one opinion or something that really happened? Just because a talking head says it, that doesn't make it true. And you once told me in your more liberal days, when it comes to religion, one needs to read the whole story and not just a passage taken out of context. I beg you to be mindful of this. I love you anyway. Always. Me. And with this, I knew my series had to also follow in the footsteps of both the postcards from 1918 and pictorialism. That meant bringing printmaking into the mix. Often pictorialist images were done in photogravure, a process that involves etching a metal plate with a photographic image. The plate is then inked and pressed onto paper to create a finished image. Many of the postcards from that era involved a similar process, definitely in the same family. It was a mass-produced process called rotogravure. And for my series, I chose to print the image with an updated version of gravure called photopolymer gravure, wherein the metal plate is covered with a light-sensitive polymer coating, which you see here. Using an Epson printer, I print a digital photograph onto the plate. I expose it to UV or sunlight, and then I rinse it with water, and the water etches the photo into the plate. Once the emulsion hardens, again by being exposed to UV light, the plate is inked, and once paper is pressed onto it, a print is made. And this is what an ink plate looks like. Dear BJ, I can't believe you're actually going to your local polling station to vote today. Do you know there is a pandemic? I don't really care if it's a tradition. Granted, you did physically mail last year's taxes right before the midnight deadline on April 15th, even though we all got an extension. I think you're doing this just for the hope of seeing political drama. Me? I opted to vote early. I walked to the county clerk's office and did it there. At the time, there were only 2 of us voting, so no lines like others have experienced. Let's hope the right candidate wins, and there's no malfeasance involved. Today, I'm walking the New River Trail to Foster Falls. This building will eventually be a hotel. Hint, hint. Always me. When it comes to producing the assets for this series, I created the photopolymer gravure prints and the postcards, which meant designing a commercial postcard back. It also involved writing to BJ, which is a font I created through a website called Calligrapher. It's based on my handwriting. And then there's the stamps, which are perforated using a pattern tool from a fabric store, and the postage is then attached separately to the postcard. From there, I actually hand cancel each card with postal marks, which are hand stamps. The stamps themselves were an adjunct project in which other artists, friends, and family members provided me with their artwork. I felt by using other people's images, it gave a wider artistic voice to the project and added a greater sense of reality to the postcards. Stamps are, after all, created by a variety of artists in a variety of styles. Dear BJ, have the aliens abducted you? Seriously, right back. I'm having a hard time quelling the panic and the feeling of being left out. Notice I leave FOMO to the kids on social media. For inoculations. You told people about your asthma, yes? A couple of my friends were on the inoculation list because they have asthma and they're under 40. Remember when Joe flying by on the Standing Rock Reservation relieved me of my asthma symptoms for my young adult years? Wish he could have helped you. Wish I could be inoculated and come see you. Please write back. Always, me. One other project I did within this series was to involve social content curation. This meant I carefully chose my audience to include people I knew who could give me good feedback about the work I wanted to include in an exhibition. I narrowed down hundreds of images to 57 of my favorites. Then using an online survey, I had my curators rate each image with a 3-star system, 1 for nope, no go, 2 for well maybe, and 3 for yes, it is a keeper. And I included a comment section for each. The feedback turned out to be extremely helpful. It came in 2 forms. I was able to see the average rating for each image, and then I was able to compare these through the comments. And this allowed me to make tweaks, and also the averages helped me which ones to narrow down to print. This particular image here was the highest rated image of the 57. I did have to balance the results with the actual story to make sure the images also helped to move the narrative forward. And this is what the first exhibition of Postcards from the Pandemic, a Pulaski memoir, actually looked like at the Radford University Art Museum on Tyler. It featured 24 images and postcards. So thank you for taking the time to view and hear my artist talk about this series. If you're intrigued and want to know more, or even want to know where it will be shown again, please visit elliskingphotography.com.